Hey there, my name is Rachael Kalaki.
I'm Annie.
And I'm Shelby. And welcome to the Magdala Podcast.
We know from experience that pornography, masturbation, and other sexual addictions are not just a guy problem.
The need for women to be accompanied in their journey toward healing from addiction has gone sorely unmet, and that's why we're here.
Magdala is a space where women can find hope, healing, and freedom from sexual addiction through support, community, and accountability.
Here on the podcast, you'll find everything from testimonies to practical advice to discussions on how to live fully as a Catholic woman.
You are not alone, and wherever you are on your journey, we welcome you to this table.
Welcome back to the Magdala Podcast. I am Rachael. I get to be solo host today, but I am joined by, I want to say a colleague, that's the word that came to mind, but just fellow worker in the vineyard and now a friend, Dr. Julia Sadusky. Julia is an expert on all things sexuality when it comes to sexual compulsion, sexual education, emerging gender identities. She's done a wide array of work in the arenas of sexuality and gender, so it's a joy to have her on the podcast today. We're actually going to be talking about addiction and will. There's a ton of misunderstandings that we're going to get into here, and also I think just a lot of unanswered questions, areas that psychology and theology are both still developing in this way. But I'm excited to get into these questions. And Julia, if you want to add anything to the introduction, maybe tell our listeners a bit about yourself.
Sure. So it's so good to be with you, Rachael. I also consider you a colleague and friend, and it's been so fun to get to follow the work of Magdala for many years now, it feels like, but just always a delight to get to talk through some of these pieces with you. And I would just say, right, that I think people listening can relate to this sense of muddy waters when it comes to addiction, compulsion, freedom. What does it mean to have autonomy in the realm of compulsion, and how do we grow that over time? So I'm just excited to have the conversation and get to talk about this more.
When I think about the addiction and will question, what just floods my mind is so many women that I've encountered over the last several years just asking, like, how do I know I'm in mortal sin? That's like a really, really pressing question and heavy question, I think, for Catholics, is how do I know I'm in mortal sin? What's interesting is my theology brain kind of immediately goes to, well, the hinge point there's no, right? Like the word no. How do you know if you're in mortal sin? If you're uncertain, that's a big deal. But especially when there's compulsion or dependency present, yeah, muddy waters is the perfect term, but I'm just kind of flooded with conversations that I can remember. I'm sure you're having the same thing, Julia, but can you talk a little bit, maybe we start there, about what does a dependency, what does a sexual compulsion do to willpower? What does it do to agency? And then we can maybe move into why that matters for talking about moral culpability.
Yeah, it's a great first question. I mean, I think when I think of compulsion and addiction even more broadly, I think of that Viktor Frankl quote where he says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And so I think in moments of compulsion, what I hear again and again from people is that the space between impulse and response doesn't exist. That there's impulse and then there's kind of the stimulus and then there's the response, and those are all blended in a compulsive process. And over time, what does that do to willpower when there's no space for us to actually exert human freedom? Well, it actually makes it really difficult for us to, after engaging in some type of behavior that compromises our freedom over time, we don't really have the ability in addiction as readily to reflect on what happened. And in not having the ability to access reflection in a very comprehensive way, it's hard to use guilt effectively. And that's something I talk about with a lot of people. Like, guilt is actually to help us interpret the consequences of our behavior and to ultimately do differently, learn what went awry here and how do I affect change next time. It's for learning. And if you can't do that, which is usually confounded by addictive processes, you're not learning You're not attuning to natural consequences very readily. Maybe if somebody points it out or you come face to face with it, you might contend with it. But if we're not able to reflect, we also can't connect emotionally to consequences. And it's emotional connection, right, to the consequences, the fallout of my behaviors that can motivate me to create more space next time, to kind of respond in a way that feels more free. And so a lot of people I talk to will say that cognitively they know, let's say a person who's married and is compulsively watching pornography will say, cognitively, I know my wife or husband is hurt. But emotionally, I don't ever really think about that. And so, right, what part of the work of therapy is helping thicken the plot there and say, let's imagine a little bit what that might be like for somebody else. Let's kind of expand space, right, between the stimulus and my own responses. And then, again, I guess one more thing I'll say here, and then I'll get you to kind of chime in and tell me what you're thinking of all of this. It's really interesting in compulsive processes to see how people's core beliefs are driving these behaviors in ways that confound our freedom. And so what are examples of core beliefs that drive compulsion? Shame, a sense of badness, a belief that I'm defective, I'm ineffective, I'm unwanted, I'm undesirable, unloved, worthless. And two things can happen in compulsion. One is the compulsive behaviors try to confirm these beliefs, so reduce the dissonance by saying, you really are bad, you really are defective, look at what you did. And in other cases are kind of in a strange way trying to challenge these beliefs by saying, somebody or something sees me as good, desirable, effective, wanted. And these behaviors confirm that maybe I do matter on some level. Well, how does this impact our freedom? None of that is happening consciously when you're 12, 15, 17. And what we try to do in therapy is build and increase people's conscious awareness of some of those processes to say, how do I have more say in the matter with some of these pieces?
That was a better summary than I could have ever hoped for. That was wonderful. So just so much in there. I'm thinking of a couple things. I'm thinking of when we're talking about like affect regulation, even just like hyperarousal versus hypoarousal. We're talking about that a lot actually lately among our staff, and just how a lot of our work is to increase what's between those two. So hyperarousal for listeners being, I'll say intense emotions. So anger, sadness, fear, when you get kind of caught up in one of those feelings in your mind, consciously maybe, but also just in your body, your sensory experience. And then hypoarousal being numbness, sadness, depression, like those experiences where your body kind of shuts down, your mind kind of shuts down. That's a more dissociative state. And in between those two things is the window of tolerance. And so like a lot of our work, I feel like, is just trying to increase the window of tolerance, because I feel like that's where consciousness, that's where discernment can happen of, okay, what's going on here? And when you're working with somebody who has a dependency that's years long on something, on a behavior that helps them either regulate that hyper or hypo-aroused state, their window of tolerance is just like really, really small or like non-existent, right? So it's really hard, I think, when people are like, I'm already really keyed up or I'm already feeling nothing, and you're telling me that the thing that helps me is a mortal sin. Like what? And it's like we need to get at least a window of tolerance in which to even discern moral culpability. I'm just thinking of my own experience too. Yeah, especially as a teen of like, yeah, there was no, there are times maybe where there was more consciousness, but between being triggered and acting out, there wasn't the awareness that I needed. There wasn't the discernment that I needed, or thinking about effects. There was nothing. It was drive and go, and you need this. That's the feeling inside your mind, right? So I'm thinking of that. I'm also thinking of the fact that, and you and I've spoken about this before, that like you pointed out, a lot of times we don't hear about I'll say like the spiritual nature or the moral nature of sexual compulsions until oftentimes after we've engaged in them multiple times. So I'm recalling the first times I heard that consuming pornography is a mortal sin. And I had already been consuming it and had developed a dependency by that point. And that's the case for so many people, especially with masturbation. I think that arises as maybe the primary one in people's experiences with that. And instead, we can get into this. The proper catechetical phrasing would be consuming pornography is a grave matter. It's a grave matter, right? But oftentimes we don't hear gravity. We hear this is a mortal sin, which isn't, we're not really capable of discerning that for other people. So I'm not sure what you're thinking in response to that, but I just have, you gave such a great summary. I have so many thoughts firing, but feel free to add whatever you see fit.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying there. It's been my experience too that, especially with masturbation, most people are not taught about masturbation, what it is, what it isn't, how it comes to be. And I can't tell you the people who share with me, I was moving in a certain way, or I was viewing something and I felt that fireworks feeling, and I'd never felt that before. And much like how kids, bite their nails or pick their nose as a way of kind of soothing or responding to stimuli, it develops in that way. And then when they go to youth group or they go on an overnight trip and they hear these categories of mortal sin, which, remember, aren't just saying this is a grave matter, they're saying this has eternal consequences for you. And that, for the concrete mind of an adolescent, does such harm. And so I think exactly what you're saying is true, that how do we be effective linguistically and honest linguistically about what we're able to say about masturbation and pornography in a group context, especially, that is actually constructive and helpful as opposed to harmful for people who are really trying to do due diligence and make sense of the gravity of the situation and what needs to be done in order to kind of be in right relationship with God.
Yeah, there's a severe psychological weight, I think, to the eternal damnation reality. Or I was having dinner with some mutual friends of ours over the weekend, and we were talking about this, of like culpability, and is there room for development of doctrine on whether or not things like consuming pornography or masturbation are grave matter. I'm not necessarily as interested in that question because I do think they're grave. I think you and I both get to see the serious ramifications these behaviors have on people's lives, however common they may be. I'm not as interested in the development there as I am, catechetical clarity of like, actually these concepts have been weaponized or just misunderstood, and well-intentioned people, I think, have, and even, I'm checking even some of my own language in the past, right? Like, I've learned how to talk about this differently and still am learning the best way to talk about this. But especially as accessibility ramps up and just all sorts of other conditions, kind of just societal conditions ramp up. I do think we need to really pay attention to how we're catechizing on this, because what you're talking about of like that weight of this has serious like spiritual effects for you and eternal consequences for you. I think that's the anxiety behind these women genuinely asking, like, how do I know if I'm in mortal sin, or should I receive the Eucharist, or those kind of panicked questions. And I know what that feels like, to sit there on Sunday and be like, well, wait, okay, I did this, but I didn't totally know, or it gets so confusing, and so panicky. And I think in many moments of my life, in those moments, like it was an encounter with God's mercy where I felt like the Lord was like, hey, just come to me, please. Like, that's what this sacrament is here for. And that's what, in essence, the sacraments are there for, is an invitation for us to always come to him. But I think I think that's the anxiety behind those questions, is like, I feel like I might be committing a mortal sin, but then if I'm wrong and I receive the Eucharist in a state of mortal sin, I've committed another one, right? So you just kind of double down on this anxiety, rather than, again, questioning the source of, actually, how were you taught about these things? What's your current experience with your behavior? What's your current, relationship with this behavior? What was your relationship with it in that particular moment? And, what difficulties might have been there. So I guess like maybe we can shift a bit and talk like a bit about the structure of, grave matter, sin, moral culpability. And I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on the outset there of like, why is this important? You've talked about the spiritual harm that can be done, but yeah, why is it important to talk about willpower when it comes to culpability and just the moral conversation of this?
Yeah, well, it really sits at the heart of discernment and reflection in the spiritual realm, right? I mean, it's important because the church, when it talks about things like masturbation, it talks about the kind of reality that, we have to account for affective immaturity. We have to account for force of acquired habit, conditions of anxiety, or other psychological and social factors that lessen or extenuate moral culpability. So the church is saying that to us. That's not you or me saying this isn't working. The church is acknowledging that something can be, against the natural order. It can be disordered, and it can be grave and problematic. And culpability matters in guiding pastoral action and understanding a person's moral responsibility. And that's helpful, I think, because otherwise, it would be great if categories of mortal sin were a kind of disincentive to kind of engage in things, but they're not. What happens when we put ourselves in a category of mortal sin when that's not accurate is it compounds shame. What I hear over and over again from people who are really well-formed Catholics and love the Lord is that it's almost as if their knowledge in the theoretical is an indictment on them in the particular moments of acting out. So you highlighted this a minute ago. If I believe that I committed a mortal sin in the moment 2 days ago, but I'm over associating responsibility, and I'm wrong about it being a mortal sin, the way that impacts my psyche is the assumption is I must be really decrepit and evil and wicked and must really not love God and must really not care about my faith because I know better. And I did it anyway. And I keep doing it despite all of the formation, even being involved in something like Magdala. People can kind of use it as an indictment. Look at how much work I've done and I still go back to this pattern. It must really mean I don't love God. And that creates a sense of real apathy. And it doesn't allow you, again, to learn from the experience, be really thoughtful about, okay, it's one thing to know in the theoretical that I have freedom. But let's go back to that moment. Like, walk me through that day and walk me through what was actually happening. And let's slow that down. And yes, that sounds like a grave matter, what happened there. But help me understand how you had full knowledge and deliberate consent. I mean, it doesn't even say just consent in the Catechism, paragraph 1857. It says deliberate consent. Like, I am asserting myself to do this thing because I want to do this thing, and I have absolute freedom to choose otherwise. Most people, when it comes to the realm of compulsion, don't at those particular moments have freedom to do otherwise. If they did, they would do otherwise. That's the whole sense of it. And so, of course, we can expand our freedom. I'm very interested in that. How do we expand that space, that creative space for me to assert my will, to ride urges that arise in me and to feel effective in that? Well, that's interesting to me. But again, these categories of mortal and venial sin are meant to be helpful for us in becoming more connected to our humanity, our value before God, and in relationship with others. And if they're not functioning in that way, we have to kind of reevaluate the helpfulness of being plagued with that in moments like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to point out for listeners too, when you use that language of force of acquired habit, conditions of anxiety, that is the Catechism's language. So you were like directly kind of paraphrasing there. And I think this is where the separation between doctrine or theology and catechesis becomes so apparent, is catechesis is in our hands. Theology is somewhat in our hands, but we're more interpreting a revelation, right? And catechesis is very much our responsibility. And so we have a responsibility to ensure that it's correct and ensure that it's truthful. And so often we don't actually use the compassionate language of the church. And And this is what I was telling friends over the weekend too, when we were kind of discussing this question, is I'm interested too in, I guess, a fuller sense of the word knowledge when it comes to addiction and dependency, because it's like, yes, I have knowledge that pornography is wrong, or consuming pornography is wrong. My body at a certain time, or my mind did, like my psyche did not know that, because it saw it as a helpful act, even though notionally I know, or yeah, I'm like, morally I know this is wrong. Spiritually, I feel the weight of this. I have like these effects and I don't want this in my life. But still something in me, until it heals and works through some trauma and some other things, it sees this as a helpful thing. It sees this as something it needs, and I see that so often in our work is women's moral knowledge of sexual sin or sexual compulsion is way ahead of their somatic knowledge and their sensory knowledge of how this thing serves them. And so I guess I want to see a fuller recognition of what knowledge means, of like, you fully know. It's like, okay, yeah, do I fully know in my sensory experience that this thing is wrong? And when you have a years-long dependency, force of acquired habit, to use the catechism's language, you don't really know that yet. You're still working on ingesting that reality. Again, doesn't make it not grave, doesn't make it not have spiritual ramifications, but you don't really, really totally know what's going on yet, and how to respond differently, like you're pointing out. I'm also just thinking of, we're actually removing, we're in the midst of a curriculum edit right now. We're removing the passages on mortal versus venial, or any questions kind of lending themselves to it, because in our curriculum, because we found it just created more anxiety and just comparison among the women in group, rather than being a productive conversation, kind of like you're pointing out. And instead, I think I'm really excited to see what happens when we turn the focus toward, just grave matter, and like acknowledging how does this affect you? How does it not right now? And how do you want it to affect you, right? Because so many women also cite the experience of like, I actually like don't care, and I want to care. I deeply want to care, but I don't right now. And I don't think we recognize that when we're talking about mortal sin too, is you have women, again, like you're pointing out, who are extremely devout, have a daily prayer life, like are very much trying to live the sacramental life of the church. And they're like, but I just really don't feel sorry for this at all yet. And why? Force of acquired habit. Like, okay, when you've been consuming pornography for 10 years, yeah, you're not going to be sorry at first, perhaps, because there's just 3 steps before even being sorry. There's working through what this provides for you, what it soothes in you. And those are really hard steps to take. So I'm excited to kind of turn the focus toward just how women in their subjectivity and their personal stories are engaging with the grave matter that these behaviors are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and especially when it comes to addiction, right? Part of the kind of diagnostic assessment for addiction is, do I go back to the behavior that causes me enormous negative consequences over time? And can I even account for negative consequences? So much of treatment of sexual addiction and other addictions is listing the costs. What are the consequences? Why? Because the brain, in that context of stimulus response with no in between, is not reflecting on those pieces. And so that's where the knowledge conversation really comes in, is, again, in that moment though, am I having the thought, this could really hurt my relationship with other people? I wonder what will happen tomorrow. Like, no, that's not happening in compulsive processes. If it was, I'd be interested in talking about the kind of assertion of will there as a rule. But that level of consciousness is not happening, and that's actually what helps us determine compulsive behavior and identify it as such, is that there's not space for cognitive engagement, emotional engagement, embodied engagement. It's just reflex. It's like when you go to the doctor, and the analogy I use, and they use that hammer to hit your knee. Well, you move, and don't move your knee. Well, then they hit it, and what happens? You move. Oh my gosh, look, it happened again. And if we could kind of respond to compulsion with that type of neutrality to say, oh, look, there it is again. And even highlight, to your point, you know, the body doesn't know differently than what it knows. I would go as far as to say the body can only know what it knows, which is that when I was 12 and I was enraged by this external thing that was happening in my life, and I had nowhere to put it, this gave me a place to put it. This gave me a container, a kind of holding space where I could be comforted. That's what the body knows in those moments. And the body is right. These things do that for us as humans. There's reasons we go back to them as human beings. They literally do offer, in some cases, comfort, connection that is not being accessed anywhere else. And so I just want to highlight and kind of really emphasize for people, you know, especially if this is part of your story, you know this, that it's not as if your body and mind are thinking, I wonder if this will help. Your body already knows it will help in just the way you need in that moment. And then after, that too is lost because of that confounding of the reflective process. And that's where recovery comes in, is how do I expand on my reflection so I can really give honor and kind of credit to what this is already doing for me, be appreciative of that, and get creative about where else can I turn now.
And it's interesting to me that if we, how do I want to put this? I guess if we kind of get locked into the mortal versus venial categories when we're talking about sin, or we just get locked into talking about sexual sin in general, like that's why I like to use interchangeable terms of sexual sin, sexual compulsion, sexual brokenness, unwanted sexual behavior. Like all of those serve to kind of show the multifaceted nature of this. But when we get locked into just that sin paradigm, I think we lose the recovery process in the sense that recovery is about recovery of your willpower. It's about a recognition of the gift of your will and the ways that that's been chipped away at or like severely damaged even by things like trauma, or mental health, conditions or ongoing dependencies and addictions. But what I think, to me, one of the most beautiful aspects of recovery is recognizing and reclaiming the gift of will. And recognizing the areas where it was taken or damaged, by things that were not my fault and then by my own doing, and just kind of the complexity of that and letting that recovery of willpower, be really at the center of the process. But I think when we get really locked into, was that mortal, was that venial, we're presupposing that people have their willpower entirely recovered. And that's just not the case at all. I'm thinking too of like, even back to Aquinas, he was pretty adept at handling moral culpability. I think, you know, he's kind of the golden hammer in so many morality conversations, kind of to like my annoyance, because people miss a lot of the context in which he's writing, and also actually the many places that he treats things like culpability. But he talks about several different ways culpability becomes hampered or will becomes hampered. I think an interesting one too that he uses is if one sin kind of is the precursor to another, the secondary sin is less culpable, right? So if I get drunk and then I act out, I am guilty for getting drunk, right? Or like, let's assess that choice. And then acting out after getting drunk, my capacity is severely diminished, right, for moral responsibility. So I think even of conditions like that, of what condition is your acting out occurring in? And it's almost always a secondary, right? Like if we're in a traumatized or hyper-aroused state, hypo-aroused state, we're depressed or we're extremely anxious or things like that. That's the first condition. And the second, acting out of those places is where the culpability is diminished. And so your attention might need to turn more to your history of depression or your experience of anxiety, or how these particular situations or relationships bring up really traumatizing experiences for you. And that's interesting to me, of that secondary thing, and how acting out in any way. Like many sexual compulsions kind of come into that category, but to think about it that way requires us to separate from that like lust versus love comparison, I'll say, which I know you and I have talked about like in a different setting, but just that like if we constantly talk about these things as sins of lust, we miss what lust partners with, and that lust is just a very willing channel, a sinful channel to be sure, but a very willing channel for so many different human experiences. And in order to get the full picture, we really have to like get out of that language being what we're locked into.
Right. And I think people are really wanting, I always ask the question, why are people getting caught in this mortal venial sin debacle at all? I mean, certainly there's been messaging and kind of top down at vulnerable seasons of life where people are kind of receptive to these categories and internalize them before they can really engage in the abstract thinking that we're doing right now. But I think there's a genuine desire in people in a couple of ways that I see, which is one, they want to be accurate about their level of responsibility. They want to have a sense of, but what do I have power and responsibility for here? They want to kind of maintain a sense of autonomy. Why is that important? Because they want to do differently. They want to reclaim their will. They want to be able to say, no, but I have a say here. I could do differently. And ironically, indicting myself for past, kind of behaviors and saying I committed a mortal sin, the hope is that maybe if it's up to me to fix it and it's all within my power and control, I can go forward and sin no more, right? There's that desire to retain a sense of autonomy and to learn and do differently. And so I always join with people in that. I say, I want that for you too. I want you to have accurate and appropriate assessment of responsibility, relative responsibility. And I want you, and I believe in your ability over time to do differently in this realm of your life. Absolutely. And I have hope for that. Here's the thing. It's not going to be helpful if it's not accurate. And so this is why the catechism is helpful. It's not that we're trying to give everybody a free pass and say, we don't care about any of this at all. It's exactly because we want people to be rightly formed in their conscience, to be able to allow the mercy of God to come into the particular places where they need his mercy so desperately. And so again, I think that's important to name too, that people are really driven with a good desire in trying to assess these categories. What I would say is to be accurate means to look at what the catechism actually says. And that accounts for a lot of things that we're not talking about when it comes to grave matters in the sexual realm.
The Magdala podcast is sponsored by the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University. The Catholic Theology Show covers themes such as the value of a Catholic higher education, religious liberty, how to pray, the philosophies of St. Thomas Aquinas, and more. Stream episodes on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and learn more by visiting the link below.
Absolutely. I think that's incredibly accurate. Just the desire to retake willpower being in the question. I guess this is a sort of a different arm of this from a theological standpoint too. It does feel just like a misunderstanding of the sacraments, because that's usually the context in which these questions come up, right? Is like, do I have to go to confession before going to mass again? And oftentimes like they've been to confession 3 or 4 times already that week, and that it's really tough to think of going again, or so many different things there. Which also, I feel like this could be its own podcast episode, but like confession can become compulsory as well in certain cases. So there's that. And Julia's like, yeah. But I'm just thinking too of like, I think it's super honorable that at least the women I've walked with and the men I've heard from as well, it's so honorable that they want to reverence the Eucharist by not receiving in a state of mortal sin. And that's actually what I turn to now, kind of similar to you, is I was like, the fact that you're even asking this question shows your reverence. Like the fact that you're even asking this question shows your disposition of love and worship. And let's just like sit with that for a second, is that your fear that your heart is cut off from God, because that's the language that's used around mortal sin, right? It's cut off, or the life of charity being cut off. sometimes I'll just say, I was like, this is not mine to discern, but to me, you don't sound like someone whose heart is really cut off. You sound like someone whose heart is really struggling, and that's okay. And I think that's another piece that's really difficult, is a lot of times we've had people discern our mortal sin for us, discern whether or not we're in it, whether that's a priest in confession, a parent, a youth minister, someone we trust, even a therapist, right? Like, these people in positions of authority sometimes discern this for us. And it actually, everything you're saying too is, this is our own responsibility to discern. And like we're talking about originally, if you don't even have the capacity to discern yet, okay, like let's start there, right? Let's increase that capacity. But usually people reveal their disposition towards the sacraments, in the question and in the misunderstanding of what the sacraments are for. Of, again, this is a place of, it's supposed to be a place of grace. These are here because we need help, because we need deep, deep, deep spiritual and sometimes corporeal assistance in the journey to heaven. And so I think sometimes like this desire to not mistreat these gifts is very good, but sometimes it misses the point of, this is actually here to help you precisely through things like this. So again, I want to emphasize as well, neither Julia nor I are saying nobody ever commits mortal sins or we all get a free pass, but rather this is just so much more complex than I think we've been catechized in the respect of sexual addiction, just because, again, our societal conditions are increasing this more and more every day.
Yeah, I think it's important in exactly the way that you're describing to just highlight that, the God who gave us these sacraments knew all of these things and has fully accounted for the magnitude of our limitations as humans, our limitations in knowledge, in understanding, in comprehension of these categories and ability to kind of perfectly apply them. He's accounted for all of that. And my spiritual director will remind me from time to time, God sees all of us and all of these things from the inside, even more intimately than we do. And we can't possibly be more willing to express compassion, which means to suffer with, than God, who knows us from the inside and knows. And that's what you're doing, Rachel, when you say to people, you sound like somebody who's really wrestling and struggling and having a spirit of reverence. You don't sound to me like somebody who is being cavalier. And so I think that reflection is so beautiful and helpful for people, because then they can actually experience the heart of the Father for them, which sees that wrestling and that desire to do good and do right and honor God and honor our bodies, which is all there as we fall short in all kinds of ways, that can coexist. And I think that's really important to hold.
Absolutely. I want to get into, that's a good lead in to the last question that I wanted to discuss. But first, I also just to give another moral framework that I think can be helpful for people. I'm also always afraid of name dropping Aquinas, because then you've got somebody who emails me and they're like, you would misquote it all. It's like, it's so fun. It's so fun. But I think, I'm thinking too of the moral framework of object, intention, circumstance. So when we're assessing the morality of an act, you have those three aspects. The object being what the act is, and then the circumstances obviously surrounding it, and the intention of the agent. So to me, and thinking of the numerous stories that I've had the privilege of hearing and encountering women in, obviously, and what you and I are talking about, the object doesn't change. Like, pornography does not shift from being a grave matter. Masturbation does not shift from being a grave matter. What changes is the intention and the circumstance, actually. And that doesn't make it a moral act, but it maybe neutralizes it more than we think. And I think the way we speak about it is that it's like the worst kind of evil every single time. And when I say neutralizes, I mean it just lessens the severity of that evil. But the intention of a lot of people that you and I have both gotten to encounter, and even thinking back to my own intentions, was not to sometimes the way pornography is spoken about is like it is disrespectful to women, or it disrupts the family. It's an offense against sexuality. I did not look at pornography or view it or read it or whatever I was doing with the intention of disrupting these things. Or I'm like, you know what? I'm really feeling like watching this today because I want to do deep disrespect to women. Like, right, I'm not thinking that. My intention is to self-soothe. My intention is to, like you said earlier, contain a negative experience that I'm feeling. My intention subconsciously was to work through traumas I had experienced and kind of take ownership over the places I lacked control. And then the circumstance, I would say, is everything from the accessibility that we have to, the circumstances of our trauma and negative experiences, the circumstance of a years long dependency and its development. And so I think that framework, I meant to add that in earlier, but I do think it's helpful for people to hear of like, we're not suggesting any change to the object, but we are talking about how complex intention and circumstance can become. So feel free to tack on to any of that, but I'd also just love to hear your suggestions of what can we do moving forward in this conversation? How can we, one, properly catechize, but then also when people are wrestling with that mortal venial sin question, how do we maybe suspend from that in ourselves and help other people suspend from that in a way that ends up being helpful for our personal morality?
Yeah, I'm reminded by what you were saying there that we're talking about actions in the moral realm, right? We're talking about morality in all of these things. And so I do think there's always value in catechesis and information to acknowledge these are moral realities. So we're not the mainstream secular narrative that says these are morally neutral as an absolute fact. And so I think even that distinguishes us. And I don't actually think that's too difficult for people to appreciate. I mean, on some level, people can hold that, they live that, they know that. You know, ask anybody who's had an affair. They can hold the negative implications of these matters. And so I think we hold that out as a reality with an open hand. Yeah, these really are moral concerns that we want to attend to. And that sometimes just brings down the anxiety that people have about like, which kind of moral is it though? Like, which type of sin is it though? And I think, again, the illusion in that is that if I get the category right, that somehow makes me more effective here. And the good aim is to be more effective here. And so I'm always thinking, what makes us more effective in developing a kind of sense of autonomy, effectiveness, a will? Well, the first thing, and I've heard you speak on this, Rachael, is curiosity. Like, not what is wrong with me, but what happened there on that Tuesday at 4 p.m.? What was that about? What was it like the day before? And when I do that in therapy with people, most people are like, I have no idea. I don't even remember that day. And that speaks to what you're saying, which is, you know, if you're dissociated, you're not having knowledge of much of anything, including what did I eat for breakfast that day, let alone the context for some of these things. So how do we become more recognizing in catechesis that we're engaging with complex cycles of human behavior? Like, what makes a person spend more money than they have? Well, there are infinite possibilities for how a person gets from point A to point D when it comes to spending habits. This is true in all realms of our life. And so I think for us to acknowledge these are complex cycles of behavior, they apply to the moral realm, which is exactly why they deserve our attentiveness. They deserve community, where we can bring this right into the open and say, well, here's what happened. And then how do I let the people around me become a kind of expert on my experience of this? Like, what exactly is it doing for me? How is it pushing me around? And, you know, you and I have done some work on this, just really trying to help people appreciate the functions of these things, that they're not just matters of sexual release and lust, that there are infinite possibilities for how we cope through all kinds of behaviors, including these. Honor, then, right? What is this doing for me? And not just begrudgingly, like, okay, I get it. That's what it does for me. How do I change it? But really sit emotionally with even a sense of appreciation for the fact that this helped me survive hard things. And for parents listening and for people in catechesis, when you're talking with somebody, your tone can be one of appreciating how this helped you survive your circumstances. Wow, that slows down anxiety. It reduces our sense of agitation towards ourselves. Our self-loathing goes down, which often will be a catalyst for these things if you don't temper it. So that's really important. And then finding ways to tweak the cycle. That's kind of the last thing. In catechesis, kind of offering that this is a cycle, like any cycle. And how do I find exit ramps or ways to just make a subtle adjustment? And you probably see this too, when people have exceptions where they didn't act out in the ways they normally do, so often that becomes its own indictment for people. They say, well, look, if I could do it differently on a Tuesday, then why on Wednesday at 5 p.m. did this happen? And it's like, wait a second. Can we just honor and learn from the effectiveness of Tuesday for a second? Like, let's just appreciate that what happened there that made that possible for you? What opened up that freedom? And there's usually 200 good reasons for that. And so again, honoring that there are always exceptions to the rule. And those are actually opportunities for learning as much as the moments where we go right back to the thing the next day is a moment for learning. And compassion is, chastity is a lifelong exacting work. It is not the ticket, the virtue ticket that gets us in the door of God's good graces. It is a lifelong exacting work that he's very familiar with, having walked with all of us the entirety of our lives. And so to bring that same willingness to walk with ourselves and to let other people walk with us, and to move away from an expectation of perfection as a sign of spiritual maturity. The people you walk with are spiritually mature in profound ways, and that coexists with the need for God's mercy, the reality of ongoing sin, and falling short of God's best for us. Both of those things coexist in the Christian life for every single one of us.
I'm going to be writing down that chastity's not the virtue ticket that gets us in the door. That's like the perfect phrase for that. I'm thinking too, when you talk about appreciation of how these things help us survive, I mean, to me, like what you're leaning towards is an appreciation of yourself, an appreciation of your own story, and the different mechanisms, the different dynamics at play there. And also everything you're suggesting, everything hopefully I'm suggesting, is to create a more robust self-mastery. Like that's what we both hope for, you in a clinical setting and me in a pastoral one, is I want to help people create a true self-mastery. And that's what the Catechism says chastity is. It's an apprenticeship in self-mastery. But we cannot be master of ourselves if we don't understand what's going on, right? And so I think that's the hope, is not lessening responsibility for the sake of just giving people a free pass, emphasizing that again, but just like I actually want self-mastery for myself, and I want it for everyone. And that requires a self-knowledge that I think is very, very difficult to acquire. And I think it was difficult to acquire hundreds of years ago when some of our frameworks were being written and kind of set in stone. But I think it's even more complex now with all that we have going on. And I find this complaint sometimes, I don't know if you've run into this, but just like why don't the same simple systems for just quote unquote getting out of these things that, used to help people, or like, it's just lust, leave it behind, whatever. Like, why don't those work anymore? And I'm always intrigued by, I'm like, what are you asking behind that question? But, I just think in our era of such, emotional overstimulation, such complexity, such like diversity of thought, diversity of upbringing, there's very little that feels cohesive in our society and our upbringings. Even within the church, there's a vast array of experiences. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it requires a lot of emotional examination, a lot of cognitive examination, and a lot of moral examination. And so this category for me kind of fits into that of, perhaps because of the complexity of our age, we're required to really dive into complexity in areas like this. And it's our responsibility to do that well and prayerfully and with a lot of compassion for one another. So I guess the only suggestion that I would tack on to what you're saying, like moving forward, is just if you are a person of authority, whether that's a priest, or a youth minister, or just someone who is responsible for forming young minds and hearts, you are welcome to disagree with Julia and I's take, but I would encourage you to examine your language around sexual sin, encourage you to think about just emphasizing, again, grave matter and all the complexities that go with that, and that fact does not change. And so it has serious effects on the human person and has serious effects on their relationships and the way they interact with themselves in the world and with God. But maybe suspend the mortal venial conversation until you're one-on-one with someone and have the chance to maybe hear more of their story. And then, I'm thinking of my husband, who's a high school moral theology teacher, and he has to teach about the conditions of a mortal sin. And then when these questions come up in class, he's very good about turning back to personal story and personal responsibility and be like, I can't answer that for you, actually. And it's okay that there isn't an answer to that today. But I'm just thinking, if you're responsible for forming young people in this area, maybe place the emphasis on grave matter, and then think about ways to speak about the nuance and complexity of our personal stories and everything we're all facing here. So that's my addition. Julia, did you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
You're reminding me as you say some of that maybe that's part of why I'm so drawn, especially with young people, to talking about God's best for us, and that we all fall short of God's best. And what is the formula the church has given us when we fall short of God's best? Well, it's kind of the going through the act of reconciliation, right? And so I think instead of getting caught in the weeds of which type of falling short of God's best is it, to kind of say, God's best for me is sanctity, it's holiness. And in countless ways on a daily basis, I fall short of God's best. In some of those ways I'm aware of, in some of those ways I'll only be aware of at the end of my life. And in all of those things, God is prepared and ready to purify me and sanctify me here and later. And he's accounted for my limitations in that regard. So when people have a penitent heart and they come to a director, a confessor, and they're saying, but is it mortal or venial? The formula of confession is just tell God all about it. God knows. How about you just tell him all about it? How about you kind of lay it down at his feet and say, I know that what I've done is not your best for me. And how that all shakes out and the details of that, I have no idea, but my heart is one that wants to be one with you and wants to be united with you. And the rites of the church, the processes of the church are meant to help us be in right relationship with God, and account for all of these things. So I think that's maybe one final encouragement is finding a path where you get to invite people to tell God all about it. He already knows, and that he's able to help us sort out the details, and they're less helpful in the particulars, and there's probably a more fruitful way to frame that lets people lay it all down instead of having to have an added burden of knowing exactly the shape and form of what they're laying down.
Totally agree. And I think that's just, the most beautiful note of encouragement to end on. Thank you, Julia, for being here and just for your wisdom and your expertise, and for your friendship. It's beautiful to have these conversations with you and receive formation from you. If any of our listeners are interested in checking out Julia's work, I highly recommend her books. She can tell you more about them in a second. I got the opportunity to endorse at least one of them, which was lovely. And then you've also developed an online video course, particularly for parents and educators, which is incredible. So feel free to tell our listeners a bit more about your resources and where they can find your work.
So the best way to follow along with what I'm doing is I have a website, juliasadusky.com, and Instagram is a kind of a great way that I'm just putting out content through Substack or some of my resources. I've written several books on kind of all things sexuality, and the one you're referencing is a 2-book series for parents published through Ave Maria Press. The first book is for parents of young kids, so think 0 to 8, on how do we teach body safety, how do we respond to exploratory play or touch of, body parts and genitalia that parents sometimes react to with anxiety and fear, and just learning how to help kids steward their sexuality as they're developing into adolescence. So that book is very trauma-informed, trying to prevent against sexual harm in children. And then the teen book is kind of your classic sex education for Catholic teens and their parents. So it's talking with your teen about sex, a practical guide for Catholics. And that's the one that I developed a video series for, because I was hearing from parents that they just needed scripting and modeling, and to hear somebody else walk through how to talk about pornography, how to develop a coping plan if a person's feeling pushed around by these things. What are the functions of masturbation? Some of the things that we've talked about today. And so I developed this video course plus this really extensive supplemental handbook that I'm really excited about, that's going to be really helpful in just making some of the concepts of the book come to life and help parents put actual handouts and reflection questions in front of their teen to guide some of these conversations. So that resource is available, and I'm sure we can put that in the show notes. And then I've written a book called Emerging Gender Identities and Emerging Sexual Identities, which are looking at the experiences of today's youth and sexual orientation and gender. So if those are interesting topics for people, those are available as well at my website.
And stay tuned, because there's more in that brain. We all know it. It's coming. Just more works to come. But thank you again, Julia, for coming. And just to our listeners, our prayers are with you, just as we kind of continue to discern our responsibility on this road to recovery. And we will catch you at the next episode.
Thanks for listening. Check out more podcast episodes, blog posts, and how to get involved with Magdala by visiting our website, magdalaministries.org. Your love is meant to change the world. We hope to see you soon.